and welcome to the Asian American Forward podcast. This week, I'm really excited because we have a guest with us. Rob Richie is the president and CEO of Fair Vote, and Don has invited him with us today to talk about ranked choice voting. So I'm really excited to kind of hear from a third voice today. And of course, as always, to talk with my regular co-host, Don's son. Don, hi.
Hi, Katie. Hi, Robert. Hi, everyone, audience. I'm happy to coming back and talk to you.
Rob, welcome. Thanks for joining us this week.
Thank you. Terrific to be on.
So to get practical matters out of the way and sort of get started, Rob, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience and just tell yourself a little bit about the work that you do with Fair Vote?
Sure. I am head of this organization that I helped start back in 1992, which it feels increasingly distant in time, but it's been a really labor of love and a growing, increasingly impactful one, I think, that has involved lots of changes in cities and states, and we're starting to elevate this conversation up into Congress and presidential elections. And it's really been about what does it mean to have a fair election system where we're fair vote? And what does it mean to have every voter in every election be able to make a difference? And that, if you apply that standard, our current rules can really fall short in a lot of ways. We are particularly known for this idea of the ranked choice ballot, so we'll get into that today. But we also have been leaders on ideas about trying to get everyone registered to vote, change presidential elections where every vote counts more, and kind of a range of ideas. But I think it's particularly timely in the era we live in right now to talk about ranked choice voting, and really glad to get into it today.
Cool. I know we talked about this before on the show with Don, especially in relationship to the New York City mayoral race, but can you give us kind of an overview of what ranked choice voting is, or RCV, kind of in layman's terms?
Yeah. So one way to start is just to keep in mind what we usually do, right? Which is we have a single choice, right? So you vote for one person. And when you are presented with two options, let's say you have a general election, it's a Democrat versus Republican. If you vote for one, you've had a very expressive choice. You've voted for one, you didn't vote for the other. And the one with more votes wins. But as soon as you have more than two choices and you're only able to vote for one, you're starting to leave your voice more silent, right? You're not saying everything you might feel. And actually it can be quite significant because you can have a candidate have the most votes who has 40%, well under 50%. And the 60% of the rest of the vote is split between two candidates. And in fact, together they're more than the candidate with 40%, but the current system says, the one with 40% wins, the one with the most votes wins. And so our current system doesn't handle having more than two choices well. And then if you have 5 choices or 10 choices, it's even more so as a problem. And the idea of a ranked choice vote is to say, let me do more than just indicate one thing. I actually have opinions about more than one person, and the candidates know that too. So they have a reason to talk to voters. So what you as a voter are doing is saying, here's my first choice. It's the one I like the most. But who's my second choice? Who is also a pretty good candidate? And who's my third choice? And you can stop whenever you want to, whenever you feel indifferent to everybody else. The way the vote tally works is to ground it in the idea that everyone has one vote. So you count your first choices as your vote in the first round. And if someone wins more than half the votes right out of the bat and wins more than half the votes in the first round, then they've won. They have more than 50%, and that's it. However, if no candidate does have 50%, they're all under that mark, that total, then the candidate who was in last place is dropped. And those candidates' ballots are moved to their second choice, to their backup. So that's the one that they liked, that they could settle as their next choice. And then you tally the votes, you see if you have a majority winner, and then you rinse and repeat. Essentially, you just continue until a candidate surpasses that 50% threshold. When it'll always get to a point where one candidate has more than 50%. And one term for it sometimes is an instant runoff, because you like a runoff election is where you have a whole separate election,
Sure.
Lots of money spent and weeks later, months later, and people come back and vote again. Essentially, the ranked choice system is simulating that without that extra trip to the polls. So one of the reasons we're seeing a lot more use of it around the country is it's just a faster, cheaper, better way of doing a runoff. But more broadly, it's a way to accommodate choice and kind of embrace the idea that we want more candidates to run. We want to hear from them, but we also want the voters who support them to have their voice be truly heard and to get fair outcomes. And ranked choice voting is designed to accomplish those goals.
It's actually about the types of elections in which this would be used. As you pointed out a couple of times, this is really important, especially in elections that have more than just two candidates. So is this like primarily the hope that this would be going towards like primary races or like more local government types of things where you have several candidates, or is kind of the eventual goal that like perhaps we have a multi-party system where there are, 3 or 5 candidates for president instead of just 2?
Yeah, well, I think it really makes sense, frankly, as a believer in this, that it for any election where you might have more than 2 choices, and basically that can be any election, right? So I think if you have a presidential election where Ralph Nader is running as a Green Party candidate, or Ross Perot is running as an independent, or Joe Jorgensen as a libertarian, these candidates that are running for president, they're already having an impact on elections as they are. In 2 states, Alaska and Maine, now use ranked choice voting for presidential elections in November. So that's already happened. And Maine used it last year, and state of Alaska will use it in 2024. 5 of the Democratic primaries and caucuses in 2020 used ranked choice voting. And that was because it was a very big field. And it really made a lot of sense to people, particularly in some of the dynamics that happen in those contests where candidates start dropping out and your first choice might not even be in the race anymore by the time your ballot is counted. So having a backup made particular sense. And we see a lot of chances to grow it in presidential primaries, other primaries, but general elections, I think, increasingly make sense whenever we cross into that threshold of having a third party or an independent candidate. And that actually happens a lot. So I think that we'll see, as we socialize and normalize ranked choice voting, essentially it makes sense for everything. Having more than a single choice is better whenever we're voting. And I think that's where we're going to get to, that ranked choice voting is just almost equal voting.
Good. Robert, can I ask your, in your life experience or ranked choice voting system, in terms of the Oakland or San Francisco, have you involved any surprising or dramatic change to the voters or to the political system? What's your experience for this particular 2 ranked choice voting system?
Yeah, it's been exciting. I'll say, just as a background to the issue, is it's used quite a lot around the world. Presidential elections in Ireland and mayoral elections in London and, Australia's, all of its elections and so on. In the United States, we had a problem because our voting equipment, when you vote on like some of the older voting equipment, it wasn't easy to absorb this ranked choice information and use it. So it really shut off the conversation. So in the modern era, ranked choice voting really took off with a first win in San Francisco. So San Francisco was the first place to pass it in 2002, started using it in 2004. And actually every year but one since then has had a ranked choice voting election. Across the Bay in California, Oakland has used ranked choice voting since 2010. And it really started to grow. It's in the last few years, in a particular, 6 more cities adopted it last year. So to Alaska, we're up to about 25 cities. But the longest standing use is in the Bay Area or in San Francisco. And those are really interesting cities as far as diversity within the diversity, right? So it's not just, black, white, it's not just black, white, Latino, it's black, white, Asian American, but Latino is also Mexican American or Salvadoran. And this is where ranked choice voting really begins to kind of sing as a system almost, because it's allowing every community that sort of wants political expression through a candidate to find a candidate to run and to win, it becomes really an exercise in coalition building in a sense, right? You rarely in a open seat race in mayor, in an open seat election for mayor in San Francisco and Oakland, candidates do not win more than half of first choices. You know you're going to need ranked choice voting. And so you start with your base of first choices, and you can't win without being a good first choice candidate. But you also know, hey, I have to be a second choice of backers of other candidates. I have to know what they think, what they support. I have to find connections with people. And then you add in that having racial and ethnic dimensions, you have to, think about other groups and so on. So Oakland's first election for mayor in 2010 was fascinating because a Chinese American woman named Jean Quan was running for president. A large
mayor.
City, or for mayor, yeah.
Yeah, making sure.
Yeah, she there never been a Chinese American candidate woman who was mayor of a major city, and she was heavily outspent by an older white politician who had about 4 to 5 times as much resources to spend either directly or through his proxies. Former Senate Majority Leader, was the favored candidate, but ultimately ended up with 33% of first choices, right? So had the most first choices, but well short of 50%. Kwan was back at 24%, so she was 9 points behind. Then there was another candidate with something like 22, and then it went on down from there. And the Kwan campaign had been all built around coalition building, right? About reaching out to different communities. She was a much more active candidate, went to far more neighborhood meetings than the front runner, who spent more money, but didn't kind of do that sort of direct engagement. And as the candidates were dropped out, who were in last place, and the ballots were moved to next choices, she was narrowing the margin. And then when the candidate in third dropped out, she jumped ahead and ultimately won by 4 points. It was controversial at the time because people were still getting used to this idea that a candidate could win the instant runoff while not leading in first choices. But it really made sense on the ground just because of the way that they ran. And it really became an understanding of how to, Oakland politicians and political consultants learned a lot. Like, you have to run that kind of way. Overall, in the Bay Area, there's over 50 seats that are elected with ranked choice voting. The number of people of color who get elected to those seats has gone from about 40% of them back 15 years ago or so to now 60%. So it's been a jump from 2 out of 5 to 3 out of 5. Women have had a big jump in success as well. And I think that the idea that all of these votes now take place in November when the turnout is higher, it's one round, it encourages candidates that are able to kind of have a base of support, but reach out to others. And that just seemingly has been good for representing diversity on those city councils and mayor seats.
Yeah, you've kind of already anticipated my next question a little bit, which is that when we started out, we were talking a lot in terms of how voters can interact with an RCV system. But then now kind of on the flip side, if you're working for a campaign, have you maybe even, because you've given us the anecdotal example of how it went in Oakland, how does it impact campaigns in general in terms of strategy? And also is there any data on how that changes kind of the landscape of a political campaign?
Yeah, it's fascinating. There is a growing amount of data. There was a pretty big project in 2013, 2014, where a group of political scientists studied 7 elections with ranked choice voting and 14 comparable cities that didn't have it. And they found that voters were experiencing elections with more engagement from the candidates. So there was more they heard from more candidates, and at least it wasn't a overnight change, but there was a perception of greater civility among the candidates. Both of those make sense, right? Because now you don't just want to get first choices, you need to find your connection to be second and third. And let's say you're particularly close to another candidate in a lot of views, like you have, and a lot of the same supporters, like you and this other candidate. In a single choice system, that's a pretty competitive situation where you might have to be pretty sharply distinguishing and might be tempted to go negative, right? To be the one that gets those votes. In a ranked choice system, you want to get more votes than that person, but you also want to be those people's second choices. So you actually have seen formal coalitions, like candidates actually endorsing each other. That happened in the San Francisco's mayor's race in 2018, where Jane Kim, who's an Asian American candidate, and she finished third and the candidate in second, both kind of formally endorsed each other. But what you more often see is just greater attention and attentiveness to, the backers of other candidates. And I think what we also are seeing is that voters are not as simple to identify and just sort of treat as a block. You have to treat individual voters as individuals. And why they like someone as a first choice doesn't necessarily mean they all think the same way. So you are starting to look for connections, and you basically don't give up on voters. So there was like a Minneapolis election for mayor, open seat race, a lot of candidates running. And the woman who won, and she actually won big, but it was an upset win also. She also was outspent. But she was seen as of the front runners, probably the most politically progressive candidate. But when the Republican backed candidate dropped out, she did better at getting his backup choices than sort of the more moderate candidate. But partly that's because her campaign had looked for connections, right? And found reasons to support. It wasn't overwhelmingly going her way, but it was surprising to a lot of people. And that sort of shows a certain, way that voters are thinking, like, so maybe they thought a lot about parks, like that's a big issue in Minneapolis, or policing or whatever it might be. And you're finding a connection. And so that kind of conversation with voters and an attempt to go beyond simple 30-second sound bites, I think is definitely incentivized with ranked choice voting.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to give us one more hypothetical example using like candidates that people are mostly probably familiar with, which is, I'm curious if you've thought about how the 2020 Democratic presidential primary might have gone differently with ranked choice voting, just kind of like as an example thought experiment.
Well, it's interesting because, 5 of those contests did have ranked choice voting, but by the time one of those was Nevada, which was the caucus state that happened third, right? There was Iowa, then there was New Hampshire, and then there was Nevada. And interesting, those caucus states, they're quirky, right? Like the people are gathered in person, and like Iowa, you're physically moving around the room. And that's actually like ranked choice voting, right? You're moving to your backup choice if your first choice can't succeed. And in some ways, you could sort of see some of a little mirror into like at least some, candidates that did well in Iowa were ones who were sort of doing better in that process. Then they had New Hampshire, and then they had Nevada, where about 70% of voters cast ranked choice ballots early. So just regular ranked choice ballots. And then they were folded in with the in-person vote. It kind of interesting. So it's hard to tease out the information. But there were candidates there, like Sanders won Nevada and Buttigieg won Iowa barely. And it's hard to sort of know for sure what going down to 2 might have meant. By the time 4 other states used ranked choice voting, essentially it was a Biden-Sanders contest. And most of those, it was effectively over by that time. What we do know is that first, people liked ranked choice voting, or they used it, so that in those states where we had data, 90% of people who backed a candidate that was below the threshold to win delegates, so they needed a backup choice, actually ranked Biden and or Sanders second or third, right? So they had their vote count. So that was 90%. If you think about that nationally, there were 3 million votes cast for withdrawn candidates by the time they were counted. So if we'd had ranked choice voting in all states, we would have probably had more than 2.5 million more votes sort of counting toward delegates. And I think that if we'd had it the whole time, and if everyone had known that we were going to have it the whole time, I think, it just would have, I think, addressed this question of how do we figure out how to get the best nominee? And it's sort of like a crowdsourcing tool. It's like allowing all of us to be part of that decision. I think ultimately what happened was there was somewhat of an inside play to figure out who was the most viable nominee, right? You sort of had like, we have to get this over and let's have it be Joe, right? And now he's president, so something worked out well for Democrats. But at the same time, it felt a little more insider, a little more of a kind of a steering of the result. And I think ranked choice voting would have allowed us to get to that answer in a more inclusive way where I think more voters could have been part of it.
Mm.
Yeah. Robert, I have involved in the San Francisco's mayor's London Bread campaign and also involved Jim Kwang's too. I remember one time I drive back from Oakland back to Cupertino, and I found Jim Kwang's wallet in my car. And then I called her at midnight. I said, Jim Kwang, you lost your wallet in my car. And I drive back. She's still working. And the conversation is, she told me that I didn't plan to win. I just want everyone pick me as a second choice, because you know that the competition for the Asian community, nobody expected Jim Kwang to win. We just want to get to participate in that process. But turned out the result is a very surprise to us. I just think that from your experience for the Asian community, the population or voters generally, they don't get involved in the political system and the process. So for the Asian community, they can either the ballot voting or they do the coalition like the Jim Kim in the San Francisco. What's your particular advice to Asian community to take advantage of a ranked choice voting system?
Yeah. Well, I think one, it's to embrace ranking, right? So, and the candidates need to encourage people to rank. And in a very basic fact, if you're a voter, is that ranking someone second has no impact on your first choice, right? Your first choice will either win or be eliminated, and then your ballot goes to your second choice, right? So there's no way that ranking someone second hurts your first choice. So there's every reason to rank. Let me give a very specific example from one San Francisco race, which was for their Board of Supervisors, their city council back in 2006. But it was a heavily Asian American district. And but the plurality first choice candidate was non-Asian American. And the next, I think 4 candidates were Asian American, I think probably Chinese American. And then one of them won with ranked choice voting. We were actually able to look at that data and we played around with it. And each time it would get down to the non-Asian candidate and an Asian candidate. But if you took out the winning Asian candidate and said, okay, what if that candidate hadn't run? What would have happened? Then the next strongest Asian American candidate would have won. If you take out both of those candidates, then the third strongest Asian American candidate would have won, because enough Asian American voters ranked through their ballots. So that's an important part of just as a voter, is to use your rankings. I think it is to not discourage people from running. The first use of it in New York City this month, there was a special election in Queens, and there were 6 South Asian candidates, 5, I think, Bangladeshi, or 4, or some like relatively high number. Ultimately, the candidate who won was a non-Asian candidate who won a majority on the first round. But there was no conversation about like, oh, you shouldn't run, like drop out, you're splitting the vote or something like that, right? So welcome people in and, think about the ways that you're connected. And I think the Asian American community overall is entering American politics. Obviously, a lot of Asian Americans have been quite successful already, but it's sort of like more voters are finding their voice, their communities are finding their interests, and ranked choice voting allows like political expression of that interest with a knowledge that other candidates have a real reason now to learn about it. And that's, I think the general message is like, run, and then rank, and your voice will be heard.
Yeah, as someone who's knowledgeable about RCV, I wanted to key in on a topic that we talk about a lot on the show, which is the upcoming NYC mayoral race, which will be this summer. And as you know, Don works for Andrew Yang's campaign. So we were curious to get your advice for Andrew Yang as he's kind of like strategizing and beginning this run in a system that's using RCV.
Yeah, well, I think that, there's an early poll or two that shows he's a very strong candidate. So you want to be a strong candidate hey, I want people to run even if they're not sure they can win, but their voice is important to be heard. But I think he is definitely in the viable group. And one message, is for all the candidates is you've got to do two things to win, right? You've got to have first choices. You've got to stand for something in a way that people want you to be the mayor, right? You have to earn that, and it's a competitive field, and you've got to have some people that say you're my person, because otherwise you can't win by being everyone's second choice. You have to have some people wanting you as a first choice. A lot of people, but you won't be able to win with first choices alone either. So then you have to be looking for those connections. And I would say, don't assume that because a candidate that may drop out might seem different than you on a lot of issues, it doesn't mean that the voter supporting that candidate might not find a connection to you, right? So that it's really keeping everyone in play. And ultimately the mayor of New York has a very fascinating, complex city to be mayor of. And this is a chance to really learn about that city. Like, you got to go to all the boroughs. You've got to find out what different groups think. And you've got to, for endorsing groups, you have to be happy if you're a third choice. You'd rather be their first choice, but don't give up and seek to be a third choice. And, really ultimately expect that you're going to be ranked first, second, or third. Like, the winning candidate will probably be ranked first, second, or third by, 60% of people, or, a relatively high number. And to achieve that, you need to really be making a lot of connections with people.
Yeah, Robert, I saw the polling. Andrew is consistent on the top of the polling, and he's always a front runner. But I just wondering, the New Yorkers, they kind of concerned about the front runner and Andrew, particularly. It's for his lack of political or city management experience. But when we apply the ranked choice voting strategy into that one, is how we overcome the weakness of lacking the experience like all other candidates. They probably involved in the New York local politics for their lifetime. What kind of a strategy or message we design during the campaign can be best utilized for this particular voting system?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, the campaign will have to grapple with how how much that matters to voters, and then find like experience that kind of shows readiness for it. I think Andrew, over the last 3 or 4 years, has surprised a lot of people by what he's been able to achieve as a candidate. And so anyone who thinks he can be knocked off his game easily probably doesn't know that success. But it is going to be, needing to, that's going to be an area that does matter to people. It's a big city, it's a big job, and but it's not the first time that someone's come into the job who wasn't a career politician. Bloomberg was not a career politician, so on. So, that's a message that the campaign will need to, to find. And what'll be interesting is there will be career politicians. If Andrew makes it into the final two, there will be career politicians who will lose during the course of the count. And if those voters are saying, I want my second choice to be also someone with lots of experience in, office here in New York, then that's not good for him, right? So he's going to need to find a way to connect with those voters. And I think the basic message that often seems to work for candidates is to have a vision of where the city can go, and have a vision of someone who is about bringing into that vision and listening, and showing a capacity to learn and act and be a leader ultimately.
We may have covered this to death, but before we close up, I do want to ask also, what's your piece of advice to voters who are maybe using RCV for the first time to vote?
Well, I think it is an interesting thing. So if you're used to a single choice system, sometimes you settle on your first choice and then you kind of just become a cheerleader for that candidate and sort of against everyone else, right? Sort of and then you start going on social media and whatever. And you have to start realizing, oh, well, my first choice might not win. Let's say people supporting Andrew Yang, they have to accept the fact he might not win. And then his supporters have to have a second choice too, right? So it's beginning to think of who is the best of the rest and learning more about candidates and sort of keeping an open mind. And we hope ultimately becoming a voter that just learns more as well, right? I'll say when Santa Fe, which New Mexico, first used ranked choice voting for mayor in 2018, they had a big jump in turnout. We've seen, particularly the last 3 or 4 years, as I think the know-how of how to run ranked choice voting is sort of getting out there, we're seeing really positive impact on voter turnout. But anyway, another impact there was open seat race for mayor, 5 candidates. Almost 2/3 of people ranked all 5 candidates, and they had more debates than they'd ever seen before, some version of 20 or so. And people said that those debates were much better attended than had ever been before. And that a lot of it was people saying, okay, I think I know who my first choice is, but I need to learn more about these other people, right, to get my second choice and so on, right? So it is an opportunity to learn more and just go a little deeper. And, this is what democracy we want it all to be about, right? Is we are giving these leaders a chance to do things, but ideally they're doing it based on the consent of the governed and our power being expressed. And I think this is a chance for us to kind of do it really well.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. Before we close, I do want to ask one last thing, which is when we're not talking about politics on this show, we're talking about books. So I like to ask our guests if they have a favorite book they want to plug or recommend to our audience.
Oh, well, that's, I should have been prepped for that one.
Surprise.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's all these good books about politics and democracy, but that's, maybe that's cheating. But let me just go ahead and give one like that. So there's a book called The Doom Loop, which is by Lee Drutman, came out last year. And Lee is someone I know well, but he makes a case that that it's the fundamentals of our electoral system, winner take all, single member district, single choice system, that are creating incentives that are like a doom loop, right? Everything kind of each year, we seem to be getting into a cycle where things seem to be descending rather than ascending. And it's actually rooted in rules that we can change. And ranked choice voting is part of that, going to a proportional voting system instead of a winner take all system as part of that. And he really he grounds that case in history. And at least for people that like political books, I think that's a really strong one.
That sounds interesting. And it's got a nice grabby title too. The Doom Loop, you said?
The Doom Loop. Yeah, the happy story of American democracy.
Fantastic. We'll wrap it up there for this week. Rob, thank you so much for joining us. It was a lot of fun to have you.
Great. Well, thank you, Kitty and Don, and good luck with this program. And way to go, New York. Well, we're really excited about what happens with ranked choice voting this year.